Okay, back for our last installment with risk management. So we're at plan risk responses, process 5 of 7. The inputs are fairly common, right? So nothing really new there. But now we'll look at the tools and techniques. There are many, right? But really there are just two big ones. And that includes strategies for individual threats. I know that. Boom, 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 pound the desk. And strategies for individual opportunities, right? It's all fairly self-explanatory, but notice that I've color-coded in purple the two that are common to each. I can escalate to a program manager, either threats or opportunities, or I can accept a threat or an opportunity. I can just let it happen if it happens. Take really no action. The PMBOK guide does talk about there's an active approach, like I might have it in the contingency reserves, but just accept it, or a passive approach, but generally escalate and accept. What is different is for a threat, I can transfer, I can avoid the risk, which means I can avoid the activity that leads to the threat, or I can transfer it to a third party like car insurance. We all have that. We've transferred that risk, or to mitigate the risk, to take action to reduce the probability and impact, maybe build a prototype or some other things. Now for opportunities, I can exploit, right? I can try and increase the probability that it's going to happen. That is in essence like an avoiding in risk. It's exploiting. I can share the opportunity, which is like transferring for threats. In opportunities, I'm sharing with a third party, maybe a joint opportunity for business. And I can enhance, I can increase the probability or impact, which is the opposite of mitigate for threats. So know all of those for strategies for individual threats, strategies for individual risks. The reason I say it that way is because one of the other tools, if you look at the PMBOK guide, is a strategy for overall risks, which kind of mix the terms. So I wanted you to be very clear. You will have a question on strategies for individual threats and individual risks, and know how they kind of pool into overall project risks, right? Which still use the terms avoid, exploit, transfer, mitigate, accept. Okay? All right, and some other tools there just to review. Now, contingency reserves, we talked about it in schedule management, we talked about it in cost management, because they were outputs of some of the processes. So here in contingency reserves, these are for known unknowns. I know the risk because I've identified it. What I don't know, because the definition of a risk is an uncertainty in a single word, I don't know if it will happen, right? So I go to the boss and I've identified it and I say, boss, I've identified these risks and here's why and here's what we plan to do. And the boss says, hey, that's gold. Thanks for doing that. And he says, but I need some money to make sure I can fulfill my contingency plan. Great. The sponsor says, I will give you contingency reserves. Here's some money for the risks you've identified to mitigate or eliminate. Here's some money for the opportunities you've identified. Thanks for justifying them. Good work. Good job. As opposed to management reserves, which are for unknown unknowns. I did not identify the risk in advance, so I did not see it coming, right? And I have to go to the boss. Expect to take a work performance report with you, an executive summary. What happened? How you can stop it from happening again, and to request the money. To be honest, in the real world, not for the exam, most bosses will put 7, 8, 12% aside for management reserves. Okay, so those were my inputs and tools and techniques. Now my outputs. My outputs, when I plan risk responses, change requests. That's a natural one. Think about it. If I just asked for contingency reserves, now I need to do change requests to go back and update my budget, right? And I might have to go back and update part of my schedule or scope. Change requests are a natural output of planning risk responses. And of course, I'll update my project management plan and my documents. Now, for an agile project, what we do is we monitor the reserves using a risk backlog, right? Recall that a backlog is prioritized for the features that you're trying to build, right? You don't know what the requirements are necessarily, but you know the features of the product that you're trying to build, and that it has risks with it. So the agile team is going to balance delivering those features while reducing risks. And that's why you have so many face-to-face meetings, including the daily stand-up, where you're assessing what you do yesterday, what issues did you have, how do we plan to resolve them, how do we move forward today. And the retrospective is another great meeting. And your user stories are helping you to refine these features and reduce risks. Also, you'll do demos for the key stakeholders at the end of each iteration. And in that demo, you will demonstrate the feature and show that the risks were eliminated. So in plan risk responses, this is kind of a contingency reserve calculation. I think you could pause the video here, review the slide. It's fairly well laid out, and get a sense of how a contingency reserve calculation would work. Now, when we plan risk responses, we want to, of course, celebrate the knowledge. So again, here's another opportunity to pause the video, review the slide, and answer these questions. Okay, so I assume you paused the video. And so the answer for part 1 would be EMV equals probability times impact, which is 0.75 times 10, or 7.5 days. So the contingency reserve for the risk is based on the project schedule, needs to add 7.5 days to it. In part 2, again, I assume you paused the video. This makes expected monetary value for the risk half of 9 days, or 4.5 days. Okay. All right. The sixth process is to implement the risk responses. And here we want to implement we want to address the overall risk while implementing responses to individual risks that we've been developing, right? Minimizing the threats, maximizing the opportunities, right? This is a process by itself in this version of the PMBOK guide for the first time ever, because it was felt that that project managers were planning responses but not implementing them. Okay, so implement the responses. Look for the triggers. Talk to your risk owners that have accepted responsibility. So it comes with its own inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs as a way of managing the risk, of monitoring the events that unfold. You can find more on this in the PMBOK Guide 11.6.3.2, right? And it's natural, again, that your outputs would be a change requests, right? Because as we implement responses, we will learn new things that may have to be updated. Now, the final process is called monitoring risk. This is really a controlling process. So we already have a sense of what the inputs, tools, and outputs will look like. We know whenever we're in a controlling process, down the monitoring and controlling process group, that whole group of controlling processes, we know that the inputs include the project plan, project documents, and work performance data. We know the outputs includes that data that's been analyzed, so work performance information, change requests, because if in that work performance information, that analysis, if we've identified a variance, we must then take action and do a change request. If the change request is approved, we have to update the project plan, and we of course want to update documents. Those are typical inputs and outputs. There's only one new one here, and that's work performance reports. because I've got a lot of forecasting that's been going on to help me identify risks in advance. And in data analysis, I have some agile items to include, like a burn down chart. We'll look at that in a minute. In fact, right here, here's a burn down chart. So in agile, I could use this in predictive too, but in agile, you can use a burn down chart to assess your risks and to track the risks that you've closed out and when the risks spiked. So a burn down chart is going to help you see where risks are and begin to reduce or accelerate those risks. So we have the risks we planned for, the risks that have actually happened, and the daily log of them happening. And that's called a burn down chart. You want to burn down the risks to 0 when we close the project. Now, risk has a function over time that we want to be aware of for the exam. And so notice on the left is the risk vertical, and on the horizontal is the project life cycle. Well, early on in the project, risks cost much less if they happen. But later on in the project, as costs to fix an event go up later in the project, the chances of your risks are declining throughout the project. As you're putting mileage behind you, risks are being eliminated or reduced. But if a risk happens later, there's less of a chance of it, but if it does, it's going to be costly. This is the essence of risk management. Here are some final thoughts. Review this on your own. Pause the video, make some notes. It's fairly self-explanatory, but useful information for studying for the exam. And then in the end, I close with this final graph that we've had all along in it's a summary. It's my summary of what we've just done. We've talked about a lot, and you need to know how it integrates together. That's your role, right? And so I list the 7 processes across the top, and in the verticals, I talk about what is happening inside of each. Then I use this break by listing the processes again, just to help you get to memorize them. And I list the key outputs that you should be focused on. So notice in identify risks, I mentioned that we are by process identifying all risks. I also am going to note their sources, maybe documenting their risk characteristics in the RBS, the risk breakdown structure, and even potential owners, right? So I'm going to identify the risks partly through stakeholder interviews and a SWOT, and I might use checklist. And I'm going to identify, mention the risk categories, because when I can group risks together, I can use the same response, right? I don't have to have a new clever response for every single risk. If I have a water category, right, I can respond to water, whether it's rain or flood or hurricane, right? And so I want to make each risk clear and unambiguous when I'm identifying them. And I'm even going to begin to nominate a risk owner. Notice the risk owner gets confirmed in qualitative analysis. Now my outputs when I identify risk is the risk register, is the big one, my list of risks, which I will prioritize next in qualitative analysis. And of course my risk reports, that executive summary, which will include a sense of the overall project risk. You can use this chart that way. Okay, I hope that's helpful. I've enjoyed it. Procurement is next.